let's talk about Here Comes Garfield. So this is the first Garfield piece of animation for anything ever. It aired on October 25th, 1982, at the same time as the Peanuts special, It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. It aired right after. About 50 million people watched. This was the first introduction to Garfield and the first piece of animation. It was, of course, written by Jim Davis, who had just started 78, 79. Garfield was first syndicated. Quentin Reviews, if you're watching this, I apologize. I'm sure there's something you could have done better than I'm going to do. But this is interesting because the design is not what we expect from Garfield and Friends. It reminds me more of Garfield strips of the early 80s, or at least my memory of them. I'm not a Garfield expert whatsoever. But there's certain things I think that are worth noting that are different, and certain things that are kind of interesting. The animation style definitely is different, and it's far more laid back than Garfield would turn out to be. Obviously, he's far more proactive. In this, he is, but it's far more chilled. Now, early 80s are a lot more chilled out in terms of media and stuff than it would be later. Like now, like people would be fine with the character just hanging out for a couple minutes and stuff then. So part of it is that, obviously. Part of it is that it is Garfield. But I do think the whole idea of this, the whole premise of Here Comes Garfield is Garfield and Odie, they're just kind of showing it. It's Garfield and John and all that stuff, and Garfield and Odie are teasing this little dog, and the owner decides to call the pound. Odie gets taken to the pound. Garfield's sort of cool with it for a bit, and then decides to rescue Odie, and so forth. In some ways, I find it to be an odd introduction to Garfield because Odie and him are first introduced. They seem to be sort of getting along, and they both decide to bother this guy. Then Odie gets taken. Now, my question, I guess, is do people know the Garfield Odie thing from the strip well enough that you could have a special like this and people understand that relationship? Or is it just sort of a bad introduction of the character? I sort of think, like, back then, people expected people to read comics. And it's sort of interesting, I noticed with the X-Men animated series on this, it's weird to think of comic book media that expects people to have read something and not just watch it, which is probably a bigger statement on comic book media or comic strip media than anything. Probably sort of a damnation on how it went from like, hey, kids are reading, to, oh, hey, kids like this character, which is a different thing, to be perfectly honest with you. But I like how laid back it was in certain respect. I thought it was a nice little special. It's not my favorite or anything like that. It was weird. This is one of the very few before Tom... Believe it or not, the guy's name is Tom Huge, I believe, who voiced John in Garfield and Friends and all the other specials. The first voice of John was Sandy Kenyon, who's sort of a character actor. He's been on all sorts of stuff, The Dick Van Dyke Show, Tom Sawyer, A Partridge Family, Hogan's Heroes. He's sort of like a character actor, all sorts of... I mean, it doesn't seem like... Yeah, he wasn't in... Not in... I don't think I've even seen him in anything. Have I? Have I seen MacArthur? Yeah, maybe. Anyway. He's Blame It on the Night? No, I haven't seen that. Anyway, he was in stuff. But yeah, he was only John in this one special. This also have Lou Rawls doing the music for Garfield. I wish they had like a deep voice R&B singer still associated with Garfield. I think that they should have kept that going, but they didn't. It is an interesting special. I think it is cool. It is not my favorite, but I do find it to be cooler to see Garfield more chilled out, I think, and a lot larger as well. He's not as like refined as the Garfield and Friends, which I grew up with that show a lot, and this started Garfield's relationship with CBS, which would go on for a good long while, or I guess Viacom, because now it's owned by Nickelodeon and all that. I would say if you're into Garfield, this is a special you should watch, because you'll be surprised how different it is, and it is the first one. It was like the beginning of Garfield. The other thing, this is something I thought about. So this comes out in October 1982. Lorenzo Music is Garfield, as he should be. And what's interesting is I always grew up with Garfield post Ghostbusters. So I knew Lorenzo Music as Bill Murray in Ghostbusters, as well as kind of doing a version. His voice reminded me of a version of Bill Murray. So it's interesting to think that before Bill Murray was still known, he was on SNL, but before, and he was in Caddyshack, which I don't think was as big of a hit as it was on video. So what I find interesting is I didn't realize Lorenzo Music as Garfield predates Bill Murray in Ghostbusters. I assumed, I find that actually interesting, because the idea of every time I've known Lorenzo Music, because of his association with the Ghostbusters cartoon, because I was watching it at the same time as Garfield, I've always looked at him as Garfield as a version of Bill Murray. But for most people, Bill Murray as the movie star hasn't actually happened at this time yet. Like, he sort of is. He's been on SNL. He's probably known to a certain extent, but he wasn't as big as he possibly could be yet. And yet, Lorenzo Music is Garfield. So maybe I'm adding too much to that, but I do feel like the association's always there, and it's sort of interesting. Anyway, I think Here Comes Garfield is a cool little special. It's very nice. I would like to review more Garfield specials. The Halloween one obviously is a favorite for everybody. I don't think this sticks out more than that. And some of the other ones I watched when I was a kid, I remember some of those. But this one, it's like a fine little thing. But I think it's sort of like a proof of concept. So I know I end up saying that about a lot of pilots, but I think that is that. I wish it had just been like maybe Garfield hanging out in some hijinks. I guess you have to do a bigger thing. But it is interesting that they rely more on that, Garfield before this comes out. That, like, there was a time comic book media understood you read comics and they don't have to fully introduce you to stuff. Or they wrote this badly, but I kind of think it's that they feel like Garfield really well, and I find that to be actually interesting. So I like Here Comes Garfield. It's far more laid back and chill. I think I'm that kind of person, so I'd be that kind of Garfield fan, and I hope Garfield gets back to this, because I think it's a cool thing for Garfield, and this seems to be celebrated at the time. It's interesting, this did come out around Halloween and doesn't really have much to do with that, but it does have a lot to do with Garfield, and it was an interesting way to introduce him. I can't say I necessarily get that from this special and think Garfield's the greatest, but I do think it sort of sums up the chilled out character in a sense. So there we go. I hope you guys like that.